Clamps, quickly. We're losing him.
Vitals are stabilizing. Wait.
All right, the rhythm is back. Good job. What is that?
His eyes, they're lighting up.
What is happening? Doctor.
The morning light drifted softly through the curtains of a quiet suburban home. 15-year-old Noah Reynolds sat on the edge of his bed, a sketchbook open across his knees. His pencil glided over the paper, tracing the delicate curve of an eye, his own. He didn't know why he kept drawing them. Maybe it helped him make sense of the strange changes he'd been noticing. The mirror on his desk caught his attention. Yesterday his eyes had been hazel, warm, steady, unremarkable. But this morning they shimmered faintly, gray-blue, almost metallic. He leaned closer, blinking once. Twice. The color didn't fade. The light seemed to move within them, shifting like reflections on water. Downstairs, the sound of dishes clinked in the kitchen. His mother, Grace Reynolds, was preparing for another long day at the clinic. She was a nurse, practical, calm, always certain. The kind of woman who could handle any emergency, but never quite slowed down for her own life. Noah called out to her, his voice uncertain. But the only reply was her steady tone rising from below, a reminder to eat breakfast, to get to school, to stay focused. Still, when he looked back at the mirror, the unease deepened. He lifted his phone, took a picture, then another. Each photo looked slightly different, the shade of his eyes shifting, alive in ways that light alone couldn't explain. At school, the day passed in a blur of chatter and fluorescent lights. Noah tried to focus on his art project, but whispers followed him down the hall. People noticed. The glimmer in his eyes caught the light differently, unnerving, almost inhuman. He brushed it off with a quiet laugh, though a knot had formed in his chest. He wasn't the kind of boy who sought attention. He preferred silence, the kind that existed only when the world stood still. And his pencil met paper. That evening, he filled page after page with sketches, spirals, waves, luminous shapes that seemed to breathe. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them again. A pulse of light, like something alive beneath the surface. When Grace came home late that night, she found him asleep at the table, a pencil still in his hand. On the page beneath it, a pair of eyes glowing faintly in a sea of darkness. Her heart softened. He reminded her so much of his father, curious, sensitive, too easily lost in his own thoughts. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. That's when she noticed it. Even in sleep, his pupils moved, subtle, twitching, as if reacting to something unseen. The next morning, Grace drove Noah to school. Sunlight broke through the clouds, washing the world in pale gold. Noah stared out the window, quiet, distant. Grace glanced over, ready to tease him awake, but froze. For just a second, only a heartbeat, his eyes flashed silver. She blinked, gone. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. That wasn't a trick of light. She'd seen it clearly. For the first time, something like fear crept in. That evening, she watched him more closely. He ate less, slept more, and sometimes she'd catch him staring into space, as though watching something she couldn't see. 3 nights later, Noah woke suddenly, breath sharp, eyes wide. The room was dark, but his vision burned with color. Shapes, threads, and moving lights pulsed behind his eyelids. And in the distance, a voice soft as static, whispering his name. When he opened his eyes, for the briefest instant, they glowed faintly. A dull silver radiance, gone as soon as it came. He sat there trembling, his reflection shimmering faintly in the window pane. Grace brought him to the clinic the next day. Her colleague, Dr. Harris, greeted them with a warm, knowing smile, the kind meant to calm worried parents. He examined Noah under bright white lights, peering into his eyes with a handheld scope. Perfectly reactive, he said. No infection, no swelling, no structural abnormalities. Grace folded her arms. But what about the color changes? Most likely hormonal, the doctor said. Adolescence can cause all kinds of variations. Sometimes even temporary pigmentation shifts. He meant well. But Grace had worked in medicine long enough to hear what wasn't being said. It was a polite dismissal, a way of saying this isn't serious enough to matter. Noah sat silently on the exam table, his gaze distant. He could feel the pulse again, that faint, rhythmic flicker somewhere deep behind his eyes. That night, he tried to draw it, not as an artist, but as a witness. Light spreading through darkness. Threads intertwining, moving in harmony, like breath itself. The days that followed felt heavier. Colors seemed sharper, almost painfully vivid. The world itself looked alive, vibrating. When Noah closed his eyes, the patterns returned, flowing, converging, pulsing. Sometimes they hurt. Sometimes they felt beautiful, but always they felt real. Grace grew quieter, more cautious. She smiled when he looked at her, but behind her eyes was worry. Every evening she checked his pupils with a flashlight. Every evening they looked fine. Yet she knew something wasn't. One night, as Noah drew by the window, Grace walked in. The lamplight hit his face just right, and she froze. His eyes shimmered, reflecting light that didn't exist in the room. Her breath caught. He noticed her stare and lowered his gaze, ashamed as though he'd done something wrong. In that moment, Grace realized this wasn't just an oddity. It was something she couldn't explain away with medical logic. Something inside her son was changing. She called Dr. Harris again the next morning, her voice firm. "I want a referral. Neurology, ophthalmology, whatever it takes." He hesitated, then agreed. That night, Grace thought Noah was asleep when she broke down on the phone. Her voice was soft, cracking under the weight she carried. "He's my only child," she whispered. "If I'm wrong, fine. But if something's growing in there and I do nothing, I couldn't live with that." Noah lay awake, hearing every word. He didn't move, didn't cry. He just stared into the darkness, where faint shapes of light still danced behind his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of being sick. He was afraid of what he might become. 2 days later, they packed an overnight bag and drove to the city for tests. The highway stretched endless before them, gray clouds rolling low overhead. Noah rested his head against the glass. Every passing streetlight left a trail, thin silver ribbons that followed the car until they disappeared. Grace kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. When she glanced in the mirror, she saw his reflection, pale, distant, glowing faintly in the dim light. And though she whispered to herself that it was only an illusion of the sun, she couldn't silence the thought growing in her chest. Something inside her son was awakening. The city hospital looked different from what Noah imagined. Everything gleamed, white floors, bright lights, the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. It felt too clean, too bright, like a world where nothing human could hide. Grace filled out forms at the counter while Noah sat silently beside her, fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. His eyes wandered across the waiting room, posters about diabetes, heart disease, and smiling doctors assuring everyone that help was near. None of them mentioned eyes that changed color on their own. When their name was called, Grace's voice trembled slightly as she stood. The nurse led them down a narrow hallway where walls hummed faintly with electricity. Noah caught his reflection in a metal cabinet. The light above flickered, and for a brief second, his pupils shimmered again, silver, then blue, then back to brown. Grace saw it too. Her breath quickened, but she said nothing. Inside the examination room, the neurologist, Dr. Lauren White, studied Noah's file. She was calm, methodical, the kind of person who spoke with her eyes before her lips. She looked up, assessing him the way a scientist might study a rare phenomenon. The first round of tests began. Light response, reflexes, retinal scans. Machines hummed softly. A narrow beam swept across his eyes again and again, recording patterns no one had seen before. Dr. White's expression stayed professional, but the nurse beside her shifted uneasily. The monitor's lines formed strange oscillations, shimmering bands that didn't match any known pattern. Grace noticed the pause. Doctors rarely paused when everything was fine. When Dr. White finally spoke, her tone carried careful neutrality, the kind of voice trained not to alarm. She requested an MRI, just to rule out a few things. That night, Noah lay inside the cold tunnel of the scanner, his head braced still. The rhythmic thumping of the machine echoed like a heartbeat, slow and relentless. He closed his eyes, and in that darkness, the same strange light returned. It pulsed from deep inside his skull, soft, rhythmic, almost like it was responding to the machine itself. Grace watched from behind the glass, hands clasped tightly under her chin. On the monitor, a cross-section of her son's brain flickered in black and white. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she could feel it in her bones. Something was there. After the scan, the technician's face betrayed a flicker of unease. He leaned close to Dr. White, whispering something she couldn't hear. The doctor's brows knit together. Then she turned toward Grace, her expression masked with professionalism. They would need to run more tests. Nothing conclusive yet, just anomalies. Grace nodded, pretending to understand. Inside, her chest hollowed out with dread. Days passed in a blur of appointments and whispered medical terms. Noah's condition didn't worsen, but his eyes now changed color faster, sometimes shifting within hours. One morning they were steel gray. By evening, they glowed with a faint, almost luminous green. Grace tried to hide her fear. She smiled more, cooked his favorite meals, and played soft music when he couldn't sleep. But Noah could feel the tension beneath her kindness. The way she lingered in the doorway at night, as if afraid he might vanish before morning. In quiet moments, he began to notice things no one else could see. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed deeper. Patterns shimmered faintly on white walls, almost like they were alive. He felt drawn to them, like they were whispering something only he could hear. When he told his mother, she listened carefully but said nothing. Not because she didn't believe him, but because believing meant acknowledging that her son's world was changing in ways she couldn't protect him from. By the end of the week, Dr. White called them back for a follow-up. Her office was calm, decorated with framed degrees and a photo of her smiling with 2 children. She seemed different now, less certain, her eyes heavier with the weight of something unspoken. The scans showed a faint mass near Noah's optic nerve, tiny, irregular, and active. Not a tumor, not exactly. More like a cluster of living tissue intertwined with nerve fibers. Grace's heart sank. Her hands trembled as she listened to the words abnormal growth and unidentified composition. Dr. White reassured her that it might be benign. But benign was a fragile word when spoken in the same sentence as growing. Further testing was scheduled. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat beside Noah's bed, watching his chest rise and fall. Every few minutes, a faint shimmer of light pulsed beneath his closed eyelids, like lightning behind clouds. She thought of all the nights she had spent in hospital wards, holding strangers' hands as they waited for results. But this time, it wasn't a stranger. This was her son. A few days later, the situation shifted from strange to alarming. Noah fainted during class. The teacher described how his eyes had flickered with light moments before he collapsed. When paramedics arrived, his pupils didn't react to light at all. At the hospital, machines beeped steadily around him. Electrodes dotted his temples. Grace sat by his side, numb and motionless, while Dr. White and her team reviewed fresh scans in the next room. The new images were clearer. The mass had expanded. Thin, web-like threads now extended deeper into the optic pathways. It wasn't growing like a tumor. It was branching, adapting, almost communicating with his brain tissue. No one could explain it. When Dr. White returned to the room, her face had lost its calm veneer. She told Grace they were contacting specialists from the university. The word unprecedented slipped quietly into the conversation. Grace nodded silently, her mind frozen between disbelief and terror. For the next few days, she lived in fragments. Coffee gone cold on the nightstand, the sound of monitors replacing sleep. Noah drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering things he couldn't quite remember. Sometimes he described lights moving inside his head, like stars underwater. Sometimes he mentioned hearing faint murmurs, rhythmic and soft. Dr. White recorded everything. Each note was written with precision, but her eyes betrayed the same awe that Grace felt. One evening, as Grace sat watching her son, she noticed something she couldn't ignore. When the room lights dimmed, his pupils glowed faintly again, not bright but visible. And for a brief second, the monitor beside him responded. The heart rate spiked, the EEG trace flared, then steadied. It was as if the light inside him had pulsed in sync with the machines. Grace pressed her hand over her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. The world had become unrecognizable. By the following morning, specialists had arrived from Atlanta. They spoke in hushed tones, studied the scans, and left the room filled with more questions than answers. Grace waited outside, clutching Noah's sketchbook, the one filled with eyes and spirals of light. The doctors called it symbolic processing, a psychological outlet. But Grace knew better. Her son had drawn what he saw long before anyone else believed it existed. Hours later, Dr. White stepped out, visibly shaken. She didn't meet Grace's eyes right away. Whatever they had found, it wasn't ordinary. Grace's world, already fragile, began to crack. No one said the word parasite. Not yet. But the tension in the room felt like a secret too heavy to stay unspoken. That night, Noah awoke briefly. His voice was weak but calm. He told his mother that the light didn't hurt anymore, that it felt warm now, like it was trying to show him something beautiful. Grace nodded, holding his hand, pretending not to tremble. Outside, the hospital lights flickered faintly, as if echoing the rhythm inside his body. And for the first time, Grace realized this was no ordinary illness. Something was growing inside her son, something that saw the world differently. The days that followed felt like weeks stretched thin. Grace moved through the hospital like a shadow, silent, steady, never really resting. Every corridor smelled the same: bleach, metal, and fear. The kind that clung to the skin no matter how much you tried to wash it away. Noah's room had become their small universe. Machines blinked softly in the dark, marking time in electric heartbeats. A nurse entered now and then, adjusting drips or noting charts, her presence polite but distant. Outside the window, life continued. Cars passed, rain came and went, and the world seemed strangely normal, indifferent to what was happening inside room 12B. Dr. White visited twice a day now. Her expression had changed. The calm certainty she carried before had melted into quiet intensity. Each time she looked at Noah's chart, her lips pressed tighter, as if the words she wanted to say didn't belong in a hospital at all. The second MRI results had arrived. What they saw didn't make sense. The mass inside Noah's head hadn't just grown. It had rearranged itself. Like a network of fine roots, it spread along the optic nerves, tracing their path backward toward the visual cortex. It wasn't random. It was organized, symmetrical, and pulsing faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat. Dr. White described it as biological intelligence. Grace didn't know what that meant. She only knew that something alive was inside her son, and it was changing him. The team of specialists, neurologists, pathologists, even a virologist from the university, met in private conference rooms. Grace was rarely included, only informed afterward through layers of medical language that made everything sound almost calm. But calm didn't exist anymore. One morning, Grace arrived earlier than usual. The sun was barely rising, painting the hallway in soft orange light. She found Dr. White alone in the observation room, staring at Noah's live EEG feed. The lines were moving in waves, not chaotic like seizures, structured, almost patterned. Like code repeating itself. Dr. White didn't turn when Grace entered. She just whispered, "It responds when he dreams." Grace stepped closer, trying to understand. When he sleeps, the neural activity changes. It synchronizes, as if something's communicating back. Grace felt her knees weaken. She didn't want to hear the word communicating. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't supposed to think. By the end of the week, Noah's symptoms grew stranger. His eyes shifted color faster, now glowing faintly even in daylight. He said he could see things others couldn't, threads of light connecting people like faint trails left behind by emotion. Grace stopped correcting him. There was truth in the way he spoke, too vivid to be imagination, but every story came with a shadow. At night his headaches returned. They struck without warning, sharp and blinding. He'd clutch his temples, gasping, saying the lights were too bright, too loud. The doctors increased his sedatives, but the pattern didn't stop. The organism, if that's what it was, seemed to react to medication, adapting almost instantly. It wasn't resisting treatment. It was learning from it. That afternoon, Grace overheard a conversation between Dr. White and a visiting neurologist. They were speaking softly, unaware that she was just outside the door. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" "No. The tissue behaves like sensory neurons, but it's not human. It doesn't match any known parasite or tumor. Could it be synthetic? Dr. White paused. There's no sign of foreign material. It's organic, entirely. But it reacts to light, sound, even emotional stimuli. Silence stretched between them. Grace backed away slowly, her heart thundering. The words "not human" echoed in her chest like thunder. By the weekend, the decision came down hard. The organism was expanding too fast. Waiting longer could risk irreversible damage to Noah's brain. They had to perform an exploratory procedure, part biopsy, part surgical inspection, to understand what they were dealing with. Grace signed the consent form with shaking hands. Her signature looked like it belonged to someone else. She sat beside her son, tracing her thumb across his hand. His skin was warm, pulsing faintly in time with the steady beep of the monitor. He looked peaceful, but there was something new in his expression, like he knew what was coming. Grace leaned in close, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. The operating room glowed under sterile white light. Dr. White and her team prepared quietly, their movements measured. The hum of machinery blended with the low rhythm of Noah's heartbeat on the monitor. Grace wasn't allowed inside. She stood behind the observation glass, pale and trembling. When the anesthesia took effect, Noah's body relaxed. The surgical team began. The incision was small, precise. Every motion was slow, deliberate. Minutes passed like hours. Then, something happened. A faint vibration ran through the instruments. One of the doctors gasped softly. Dr. White leaned closer to the monitor. There, on the live feed, something moved. The mass wasn't dormant. Under the camera's light, the neural cluster shifted, contracting and expanding like a heartbeat. Tiny filaments glimmered, reflecting the light like threads of silver. No one spoke. The nurse's breathing quickened. Dr. White instructed the assistant to hold position. The surgical tool hovered above the tissue. Then, slowly, the organism pulsed again, brighter this time, and for a moment the monitor beside them flickered. Noah's brainwaves spiked sharply, even though he was under full anesthesia. The surgeon froze. It was reacting to them. Dr. White stepped back, her voice calm but urgent. "Stop all movement. Don't touch it." The room fell silent except for the soft whir of machines. The glowing tissue pulsated once more, then stilled, as if listening. Through the glass, Grace's breath fogged the window. She couldn't see details, only the stillness in the room and the unease in the doctor's posture. She knew something had changed. The surgery was halted after 20 minutes. When Dr. White emerged, her mask hung loosely around her neck. Her eyes were wide, not terrified, but deeply unsettled. Grace rose to meet her, hands trembling. Dr. White spoke softly, choosing every word with care. They had confirmed the mass was alive, an organized structure of nerve-like tissue that responded to external stimuli. But there was more. When they had shined the operating light directly onto it, the tissue contracted sharply, as if in pain. Seconds later, Noah's brainwaves had mirrored that reaction. The two were linked. Whatever this organism was, it wasn't separate from Noah anymore. It was connected to his vision, to his brain, maybe even to his consciousness. Removing it now could destroy everything that made him who he was. Grace sank into the chair, her breath shallow. The world blurred into a whirl of color and sound. That night, she sat by Noah's bed again. The machines hummed softly, casting faint reflections on the walls. The smell of antiseptic had faded, replaced by something gentler, like rain against glass. She stared at her son's face, at the faint shimmer in his eyelids. His body was still, but his mind seemed alive in some other place, unreachable to her. Grace whispered to him, though she didn't know if he could hear. She promised she would fight, that she wouldn't let fear decide what happened next. In her heart, she felt something shift, the same rhythm that pulsed through the room earlier. A connection she couldn't explain. It was as if her son wasn't alone in his struggle. Something inside him was aware, responding to love, to light, to the sound of her voice. When morning came, Dr. White entered quietly. She placed new images on the light board. Grace followed her gaze and froze. The structure inside Noah's optic nerve had changed again overnight. It had grown into a more intricate pattern, symmetrical, like branches of a tree or veins of light radiating outward. It wasn't random. It was beautiful. Grace couldn't find words. She just stared at the luminous design glowing faintly on the film. Dr. White said nothing for a long time. Then she whispered, "Whatever it is." "It's not fighting him anymore. It's adapting to him." Grace's throat tightened. The fear inside her began to twist into something new. A fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe it was a beginning. The hospital had the kind of silence that presses on your chest, a quiet born not from peace, but from fear. Behind the glass walls of the neurology wing, fluorescent light painted everything sterile and cold. Machines hummed softly, each one keeping time with Noah's unsteady breathing. Caroline sat alone outside the examination room, her fingers locked together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Hours had passed since the MRI, yet no one had spoken to her. Every minute stretched like a lifetime. Through the glass, she could see Noah lying still, his face pale under the soft halo of light. Electrodes clung to his temples. The monitor above his head flickered, recording the strange dance of signals inside his brain. Something was happening, something the doctors didn't understand. When Dr. Patel finally appeared, her face carried that kind of heavy calm doctors wear when words are dangerous. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she held the tablet close to her chest, staring at the images glowing on the screen. Noah's scans filled it, layer by layer, slice by slice, until it revealed something no one expected. Along the optic nerve, the pale threads of tissue had separated slightly, like roots wrapping around something foreign. And within that space, a cluster of small, faintly pulsing shapes. They weren't still. They moved, slowly, rhythmically. Dr. Patel leaned closer, her brow tightening. Every few seconds, the shapes gave off a faint shimmer, an internal light, impossible under normal imaging. It looked almost responsive, as though reacting to the energy of Noah's own neural signals. It wasn't a tumor. It wasn't fluid. It was alive. Caroline's heart thudded as she stood beside the monitor, her reflection ghosting over her son's MRI. She couldn't make sense of it, but she could feel the terror crawling up her spine. Whatever it was inside her boy, inside the very thread that connected him to sight, to the world, to her. Dr. Patel spoke slowly, carefully. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of uncertainty. She said that they needed to run a neuro-ophthalmic test, a scan that would show whether the anomaly was interacting with Noah's optic cortex. The results would tell them one thing. Was this something that had grown from Noah's body? Or into it? That night, Caroline wasn't allowed in the lab. She waited outside again, listening through the glass to the hum of machines, the sharp whispers of nurses. Through the half-open door, she caught glimpses of movement, the white coats bending, monitors flashing, Noah's eyelashes flickering under sedation. The doctors watched the feed in real time. And that's when they saw it. Each time the electrode sent a tiny impulse through Noah's optic nerve, the luminous cluster reacted, contracting and expanding, almost breathing. Then, as if sensing observation, one of the shapes emitted a faint pulse of light, timed perfectly with Noah's heartbeat. In the control room, someone muttered that it was impossible. No human tissue should do that. No living parasite could sync with a host's pulse like that, not without intelligent coordination. And then came the sound that made everyone freeze. A whisper, almost electrical, coming from the audio feed connected to Noah's neural interface. A soft, rhythmic vibration, like a voice without language. One of the technicians pulled off his headphones, his face pale. He swore he heard the word "see." By morning, Dr. Patel gathered her team for an emergency consultation. Specialists from other hospitals were called. The theories ranged from neural symbiosis to photonic parasitism, none of which fully explained the shimmering light, nor why Noah's eyes kept changing color. Caroline listened in silence, her body trembling. She didn't care about the theories. She just wanted her son back. But even she began to notice something else, something that couldn't be explained by scans or data. Noah had started to sense people before they entered the room. He would whisper that someone was outside the door, seconds before the handle turned. He said that light looked different now, that it felt warm, like it had weight. Dr. Patel noted everything, but her eyes betrayed the same unease that everyone felt. The unknown was no longer just inside Noah's eyes. It was inside the air around him, like the light itself had begun to change. Later that evening, the decision came. They would perform a microsurgical biopsy on the optic sheath, just enough to identify what was living inside him, without risking total blindness. Caroline signed the consent form with trembling hands. Her name looked foreign on the page, blurred through tears. She wasn't just signing a paper, she was signing a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Through the glass, she saw Noah again, still, calm, unaware of the storm about to unfold. His eyes, half open under the soft light, glowed faintly with a hue no one could name. Not blue, not green, but something in between, like light trapped inside water. Dr. Patel stood beside the surgical table, her mask hiding her expression. Around her, a team of 4 prepared instruments, the reflection of the bright overhead lamp gleaming off the metal. They injected anesthesia, adjusted the ocular stabilizer, and began. But just as the first incision was made, the monitor spiked. A flash of light burst through Noah's pupils, blindingly bright, forcing the entire room to step back. For 3 seconds, the lights in the room flickered, and the ECG screamed. Then everything went silent. Noah's eyes remained open, unblinking. And deep within the monitor feed, the anomaly pulsed once, then stopped moving. Everyone froze. In the hallway, Caroline pressed her hand against the cold window, her breath fogging the glass. She didn't understand what had happened, but she knew something had changed. Dr. Patel emerged moments later, pale, eyes wide, still holding her gloves. Behind her, Noah's vitals steadied again, as if nothing had happened. But the color of his eyes, now a deep glowing amber, told a different story. Whatever was inside him had awakened. The surgery room was silent now, the kind of silence that feels alive. The air was heavy with antiseptic and fear. Every monitor light blinked softly, as though holding its breath. Noah lay motionless under the surgical lamps, his eyelashes trembling slightly as anesthesia pulled him into stillness. His pupils, dilated and glowing faintly, reflected the world like twin amber suns. Dr. Patel adjusted her gloves, her voice steady but quiet. No one spoke more than necessary. What had happened during the scan, that burst of light, had shaken everyone. Yet the team moved forward because science demanded answers, and because Caroline Reynolds had begged for them. They began with the incision, a microscopic opening near the orbital cavity. The endoscopic camera slid gently into place, projecting the inside of Noah's optic nerve onto a high-definition monitor. At first, everything looked normal, pale neural tissue, faint threads of blood vessels. But then, as the camera adjusted, a faint shimmer appeared. It wasn't a reflection. It was movement. Tiny filaments of light curled around the nerve like roots of living fire, intertwined with Noah's own tissue. They pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, glowing faintly each time his pulse rose. Dr. Patel froze. She couldn't move her hand. The image on the screen didn't look biological. It looked intentional, as though it had arranged itself with purpose. Each filament branched from a central node, a small spherical core about the size of a raindrop. It emitted a slow, rhythmic light, like something alive but not from this world. Outside, Caroline waited in the dim corridor, listening to every sound behind the doors. Her hands clasped the cross necklace she'd worn since her husband's death. The faint vibration of the machines echoed down the hall. She tried to pray, but no words came. Only one thought repeated itself, over and over. Please don't take him away. Inside the operating room, Dr. Patel whispered an order to the anesthesiologist. They increased sedation, then carefully extended the probe. As the surgical laser approached the glowing cluster, the unexpected happened. The light reacted. It brightened rapidly, flooding the camera feed with gold. The monitors glitched, throwing static across the screens. A hum filled the air, low and resonant, vibrating through the instruments like an invisible frequency. Noah's heart rate spiked. His fingers twitched. Then the voice returned. It wasn't speech. Not exactly. It was a sound that trembled between mechanical and human, like the echo of a word forming in the wrong dimension. One of the nurses gasped. The sound was faint but distinct. It said, "He sees." The operating lights flickered. Dr. Patel shouted for backup power, but before anyone could move, Noah's entire body jolted upward, not violently, but as if lifted by something unseen. His chest arched, and from beneath his closed eyelids, light burst forth. Not reflected light, but emitted. Amber, white, then silver. Each wave washed across the room, illuminating every face, every trembling hand. And then, for a single impossible moment, everyone in that room saw something they couldn't explain. They saw what Noah saw. A landscape made of light, fluid and endless. Shapes moving like memory, fragments of color folding in on themselves. It wasn't pain or fear. It was vast, intelligent, watching, and at the center of it all, a whisper. We are not inside him. We are through him. The light vanished. Noah's body collapsed back onto the table, still breathing, vitals stabilizing. The monitors came back online, one by one. Dr. Patel stood frozen, scalpel in hand. Her eyes glistened with disbelief. She had no words for what she'd just seen. Science had none. The spherical core on the screen had dimmed, still visible but no longer pulsing. Like it had gone dormant. Noah's optic nerves looked untouched, uninjured. It was as if nothing had happened at all. When Caroline was finally allowed into the recovery room, she hesitated before approaching the bed. Noah's skin looked pale but peaceful. His chest rose and fell steadily. For the first time in weeks, there was no pain etched into his face. Then he opened his eyes. They weren't amber anymore. They were silver, pure, reflective, shimmering like liquid glass. Caroline gasped softly. But Noah smiled, a calm, tired smile. He looked at his mother for a long moment before whispering, barely audibly, "It's okay, Mom, I can still see you." She wept silently, holding his hand to her chest. Over the next few days, the hospital became a quiet storm of speculation. Specialists from around the world requested data. Some said it was a neural mutation, others claimed it was a bioluminescent parasite. But no one could explain the synchronized light pulses, nor the brief collective vision witnessed in the room. Noah recovered faster than expected. His headaches vanished. His vision improved beyond normal levels. He could see details others couldn't. Distant movement, microscopic textures, even light in wavelengths invisible to the human eye. But more than that, Noah began to feel light, to sense people's emotions as shifts in brightness. He once told his mother, in his quiet, gentle voice, that everyone carried their own color, that sadness dimmed it, and love made it burn. Caroline didn't understand, but she didn't need to. Her son was alive. That was enough. A few weeks later, Noah and his mother walked out of the hospital into the morning light. The air smelled of rain. Caroline held his arm gently as they crossed the parking lot. She caught her reflection in his eyes, not silver anymore, but a mix of every color she'd ever seen in him. Behind them, Dr. Patel stood at the window, still haunted by the memory of that light, by the word that had echoed in her head ever since. He sees, not just the world, but something beyond it. That night, as Noah sat by his window sketching the sunset, his eyes shimmered faintly again, not with sickness, but with something serene. He drew what he saw, streaks of color winding through the air, like threads of light connecting everything and everyone. When his mother peeked in, he smiled and said softly, "It's all connected, Mom. We just don't see it until it's inside us." Caroline placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered a prayer she didn't know the words for. In that moment, she realized the truth. Whatever had entered her son wasn't there to destroy him. It had chosen him, maybe to remind the world that light doesn't just exist in the sky. Sometimes, it finds a home in the eyes of those who have suffered enough to see differently. For weeks after the surgery, the world outside kept moving. Cars still honked, people still argued, and the news kept talking about things that didn't matter. But for Caroline Reynolds, time had slowed into something quieter, almost sacred. She would wake every morning to the sound of Noah's pencil scratching against paper, the same sound she'd heard since he was a child. But now his sketches were different. They weren't of comic heroes or mountain trails anymore. They were of light, not just beams or flares, but shapes, currents, and tides. Light that seemed to breathe. Every stroke looked alive. Every page shimmered faintly when the sun hit it. Dr. Patel visited them once a week at home, not because of any medical necessity, but because she couldn't let it go. What she saw in that operating room had followed her, into her dreams, her doubts, and the way she looked at the sky. She ran every test imaginable on Noah. His vitals were perfect, his brain scans stable. No trace of the foreign mass remained, except for faint threads of luminescence embedded deep within his optic nerve, inert, harmless, and still beautiful. When she asked him how he was feeling, he would always smile the same soft, distant smile and say, "I'm seeing things differently now." But she knew he didn't mean the world around him. He meant within it. One evening, Caroline found him sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The whole sky burned gold, and for a second, the same amber glow flickered in his eyes, just a trace, like a memory whispering, "I'm still here." She sat beside him without a word. There was no need to ask what he was thinking. Sometimes love doesn't need language. It just needs presence. He had become quieter since the surgery, not withdrawn, but thoughtful. He'd watch people in the park, stray cats on the fence, a plane tracing its path across the horizon, as though everything carried a message invisible to everyone else. Once, he told his mother that when he looked at people, he could see how their emotions bent the air around them, how grief darkened it, how kindness made it sparkle. Caroline didn't know whether to believe him, but she knew he believed it, and somehow that was enough. At school, things were harder. Teenagers aren't kind to what they don't understand. They whispered behind his back, called him Mirror Eyes or the Alien Kid. Some were fascinated, others afraid. Noah never fought back. He simply watched them, his calmness disarming in a way that made their laughter feel hollow. But something strange began to happen. Those who mocked him the most started coming to him in secret, one by one. A girl who'd been bullied for her stutter. A boy whose father drank himself to sleep every night. They'd sit beside him at lunch, awkward at first, then spilling everything they couldn't tell anyone else, and when they spoke, Noah would just listen. Sometimes that was all he did, just listen. When they left, they always said the same thing. "I don't know why, but I feel lighter." Word spread. Soon, students began calling him the boy with the calm eyes. Not in mockery this time, but in reverence. Meanwhile, Caroline received letters from researchers, reporters, even a government agency wanting to study Noah's case. She refused them all. The world had already taken enough from her son, his peace, his normal childhood, his privacy. He wasn't an experiment. He was her miracle. Late at night, she'd sometimes stand at his doorway watching him asleep. His eyes, even behind closed lids, still caught the moonlight in a way that made her breath catch. She often wondered what he saw in his dreams, what landscapes of light still lingered behind those silver irises. Sometimes she'd imagine that maybe he was still connected to whatever had touched him that night in the hospital, and maybe, somehow, it was still watching over him. Dr. Patel eventually published a paper, anonymized, cautious, full of disclaimers and unanswered questions. She titled it Neural Photonic Symbiosis, a Case Study in Optic Anomaly. But she kept the real truth out of it, the moment when time had stopped in that operating room, when light had spoken through a boy's still body. No journal would ever believe it. And maybe it wasn't meant to be believed. Still, she often returned to that moment in her mind, to the blinding white, and the whisper that had echoed through every machine in the room. He sees. She began to see her patients differently after that. Not as cases, but as people carrying their own quiet forms of light. One winter evening, months after the surgery, Caroline found Noah in the backyard, barefoot in the snow, staring at the stars. The night was so clear it almost didn't look real. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like a trail of shattered glass. She wanted to scold him for being outside in the cold, but stopped when she saw his face. He wasn't looking at the stars. He was listening to them. When she stepped closer, she realized his eyes were reflecting the night sky perfectly, every star mirrored, every constellation alive. For a moment, she thought she saw the same golden shimmer she'd seen that first day in the hospital, faint but familiar. She didn't speak. She just watched, and in that silence, something inside her shifted. The fear she'd been carrying, the dread that the light inside her son was unnatural, dangerous, began to fade. Maybe this wasn't something to fight. Maybe it was something to welcome. Weeks later, Noah painted something new, a massive canvas that filled their living room. It wasn't of light this time, but of shadows. Long, soft, intertwined shadows beneath a field of silver. When Caroline asked him what it was, he simply said, "It's what light leaves behind when it passes through us." She didn't fully understand, but somehow it made her cry. Years passed. The world moved on. The story of Noah Reynolds became a quiet legend whispered among doctors, a medical impossibility, they called it. But to the people who'd met him, who'd sat with him, who'd felt that strange calm when he looked at them, it was never just science. He grew up, studied art and neuroscience, the perfect blend of what had once tried to divide him. His mother aged gently beside him, her hair silvering to match the shimmer of his eyes. And though he never spoke publicly about what happened inside that hospital, every one of his paintings carried traces of it, the same pattern, the same luminous threads that once pulsed in his nerves. One day, when a young journalist asked him if he remembered that night, if he remembered seeing whatever it was inside him, he only smiled. "I don't think it was inside me," he said. "I think it was always around us. We just need to go blind enough to finally see." In the final scene, Caroline sat in her old chair, watching her grown son teaching children how to paint sunlight, real sunlight the way he saw it, with warmth and patience and color, her eyes filled with tears, because she realized something she'd never dared to say out loud, that the strange light which once terrified her had not stolen her son. It had given him back to the world, brighter than ever, and somewhere deep in her heart, a quiet voice whispered the same words she'd heard once in her sleep, the night after his surgery. He doesn't just see light. He reminds others where theirs is hiding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to stay with us for more true care moments, where every pain leads to hope and every mystery finds its light. Subscribe, share, and keep the kindness alive.